CNN, the most trusted name in news.
You are on the story. Tell us what you want to see covered on this show. Email us at onthestory@cnn.com. Now, this week was heavy news coverage of the claims that U.S. Marines killed 24 Iraqi civilians in Haditha, Iraq. Let's look at what this audience thinks about the news coverage. I want to see a show of hands here of those of you who think the news coverage of this topic has been negative toward the military. Give me a big show of hands for those of you who think it's been negative toward the military. And that looks like the majority of you. Let's see those who think it hasn't been negative toward the military. How many people think it hasn't been negative toward the military? Okay, a very small minority of this audience thinks it hasn't been, and it has drawn a sharp response online as well. For instance, Uncle Jimbo of Black5.net blasts what he calls anti-war media activists for using the Haditha story to, in his words, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Uncle Jimbo, Jim Hansen, joins us now via webcam from Madison, Wisconsin. Jim, thanks for being with us. Your sense of the sharp response that it's drawn is mirrored by this audience, and I'm sure by people who are watching this show at their homes. Tell me what you think the problem is. What has the media done wrong? Why do you think it's been negative toward the military?
I'll be honest, Ali, I think that generally there's an anti-military bias in the media, and in this situation, I don't think it's been any more egregious than usual. I think to the extent that it's been fair-handed, it's been as fair-handed in this instance as any. The problem I have seen, and it represents a big threat to us worldwide, is people like Representative John Murtha going on television and everywhere else claiming that these Marines are actually guilty, that they did these things, and that it's a statement of fact as opposed to an investigation that hasn't been finalized and results not in, no charges, let alone a trial. I think it was a disgrace for him to act that way, and as a U.S. congressman, people overseas actually respect that office, whether or not we do, and I think that's done tremendous harm.
Jim, on one of your blogs, you link to Arwa Damon's CNN.com post about the time that you've been in Haditha. Here's what you say. As the CNN reporter previously embedded with the accused Marines noted, our troops are overly cautious about hurting civilians, even to their own possible detriment. So how then could something like this happen? We've kept Arwa with us. Arwa Damon is in Beirut right now. Arwa, I'm sure when writing this, I don't know if you knew that someone would put this on a blog and link to it. Jim has used it to suggest that you don't believe it could have happened.
Well, I'd like to point out at this point, say not that I don't believe that it could have happened, but I'm not going to pass judgment just yet, and perhaps that is because of my previous experience with the Marines, in which when it comes to face-to-face combat, they have been incredibly careful and incredibly meticulous in how they clear these houses and the amount of self-control that they have going through a door not knowing what is on the other side. Now, that being said, there are a number of times when civilians are killed in airstrikes at checkpoints across Iraq, and especially when it comes to the airstrikes in these face-to-face combat scenarios, if a unit, in my experience, is pinned down in a given location for any amount of time and is unable to move forward, they do call in an airstrike, and there are many cases when the buildings that they are being fired from have insurgents inside them, or when the airstrike simply hit the wrong building.
Jim, so really it's interesting because R was making your point, so I'm not quite sure where we think that the bias is, but just like you don't want Congressman Murtha talking about who might be guilty or not, clearly we don't know.
Absolutely, and that's what was refreshing. I didn't think that Arwa was saying they couldn't have done it. I think she was giving them the benefit of the doubt, and I think that's what hasn't happened in way too many of these cases. There was a tremendous rush to judgment. In Congressman Murtha's case, he's advocated cutting and running from Iran and leaving it to be a potential al-Qaeda victory. What I would like to see him do is at least wait for an investigation, at least wait for a trial, and if these men are guilty, if this was a massacre, myself, anyone else in the military, and the rest of the Marine Corps would help them knit a rope to hang them. It's not a question of excusing a potential massacre. We just like the facts to come out. And there's another case. There was a Lieutenant Ilario Pantano who was accused of killing 2 insurgents who were under detention. He was cleared, let go, and the charges against him were dropped. He had already been tried and convicted in the press and spent a considerable amount of time thinking he might spend his life in prison. I just think it's fair to go ahead and give the benefit of the doubt to these folks until we know better.
All right, let me see what the audience has to say. Your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Siobhan Byram from Los Angeles, California. And as we know, civilian deaths are not a new element of war. And do you think that with insurgent-type warfare, civilian deaths will not only be a fact, but will increase in quantity as we attempt to seek out terrorists in unconventional battlefields?
Gosh, I hope not. I guess I'd like to think we're learning as we go along. I mean, this isn't new. We have not fought an insurgent warfare like this. And throughout history, it's not been a type of warfare that countries have been very successful in countering. So I think it's extremely difficult. And I think the biggest problem we have is we can't afford to lose the trust of the Iraqis who are happy we liberated them. If they believe their Prime Minister, Maliki, made a statement today saying that it was commonplace that U.S. troops were running over civilians and basically disrespecting the value of Iraqi life. Now, I believe a large part of that was Iraqi politics, but we can't afford to let that come across.
Arwa, you still there? Arwa, you deal with this every day. Do you take this into account when you're doing your reporting? Do you sit there and say, do you think people back home are going to think this is fair? Or do you do it? How do you take what Jim says and work it into your reporting?
I honestly believe that what we can do, and pretty much the only thing that we can do in Iraq, especially when we're down in these embedded, on the ground, boots on the ground scenarios, is we can take what we see in a 24-hour period of time, try to absorb that in all of the elements of the intensity and the entire gamut of emotion that happens, and try to regurgitate that into a 3-minute story that the audience can see. But we can only report what we see, what we know, and what we've experienced.
Arwa Damon in Beirut and Jim Hansen, thanks for joining us. On the Story took us from the deadly streets of Haditha to the Pentagon and the White House and medical transplants. Well, we're back in a moment with what we're looking for next week on The Story.